Good evening, everyone. I'm running about a minute behind. I didn't start at exactly 6:30 because there was still people entering the room, and I was trying to wait for it to start slowing down a little bit. But I'm just going to go ahead and get started. Thank you for logging on this evening. As a reminder, I'm doing this webinar as a response to a common question that I'm getting when I am out and about doing different presentations or participating in different programs and events regarding the history of African American people in the 19th century and before, which generally gets you to the period of slavery. And so one of the common questions that I'm getting is, why would enslaved people practice Christianity when Christianity was being used to justify their enslavement? So we're going to go through that today. I'm going to give you some framework about how to think about certain things, about some common language or concepts or ideology that's in a lot of the antique books that I do have, to give you a framework. And then we're just going to really jump into letting them tell you themselves. So I have transcribed some of the records and some of the books because I thought about just taking screenshots for you and then, trying to read old print. But what I decided to do was to actually give you a screenshot of the front of the books, or sometimes the books have sketches of the people. So I'm giving you the sketches of the people or the front copy of the book in which the formerly enslaved people wrote their own story. And then I transcribed or just typed up what they said, or a certain passage that I thought was a really good example for you to see what they thought about Christianity. And then we're really just going to go from one person to the next so they can just tell you in their own words. There's actually a lot of literature, pamphlets, they call them leaflets, and books, formerly enslaved people telling you their own story in their own words. I don't think it's a mistake that when we are taught about African-American literature, they don't really like to start until the Harlem Renaissance period, the early 1900s, 1920s. We get Langston Hughes, we get Zora Neale Hurston and things of that sort, but we don't talk about the fact that there was African-American literature we're talking about early 1800s, and there's so much of it out there. It's almost like hiding the fact that they are talking to you from the past, and we'll give you the information straight from them. So we're just going to just do it that way. So there's going to be a period within the presentation that's going to feel like a big no-no from what you've been taught in school with PowerPoint presentations, where you are generally told that you shouldn't read your presentation to your audience. But because the point of this is to get it straight from the people, I'm going to do a lot of reading off the PowerPoint. And so the PowerPoint, the purpose is to accommodate the two types of learners. You have audio learners, people who learn better when they hear it. And then you have visual learners, people who learn better when they see it. And then you have the dual learners who learn better when they have both at the same time, which is why you have a PowerPoint today. And so you're just not staring at a blank screen. I also wanted to show you an example. I didn't have it ready. Of how I keep a lot of the antiquity books that I have written by enslaved people. They're actually hard to come by. I get them at auctions a lot of times, and they're not cheap because everybody wants them. And so when I do get them, I do wrap it in this plastic to keep it safe. And so I just want you to see the references that I'm showing you guys. So this is an example of one. It's a very delicate book. It's called Aunt Sally. And Aunt Sally wrote her story in 1866. So this is right after emancipation. But what I wanted to show you about Aunt Sally is that this is an example, I'm trying to be really delicate, of when they sketch a picture and include a picture of the person within the book. I'm trying not to bend the scene too much, but if you can see it, I have the spotlight for you. So this is an example of the type of literature that we're going through. in order to show you what the enslaved and the formerly enslaved community thought about Christianity. And so we're just going to jump right into it. Okay, so for questions, I would love to answer your questions at the end. So I'm not going to ask you to jot down or make notes of your questions. What I want you to do is, if you notice on your Zoom, you should see a feature there where it says Q&A. In the Q&A section is where you can just go ahead and put your questions throughout the presentation. And then at the end, I will attempt to answer your questions. If I don't know, I will tell you I don't know. If I do know, I'll tell you what I believe the answer is, just based on the research and the reading that I have done. If you ask a question and I end up answering the question later on in the presentation, I'll be able to tell, and I'll just skip that question because I answered it earlier in the presentation. If I answered it earlier, I won't just skip your question so you don't know. I'll say that it was addressed earlier in the presentation and try to repeat what that answer to that question is. Okay, so first, just to introduce, is the More Than a Fraction Foundation. I'm the executive director of, and we started the foundation with one just really main goal. And the main goal is to relook at how we're presented history, at early African-American history, especially during the period of slavery, and relook at that history, research that history, from the point of view of the enslaved people. If you don't realize, a lot of what you're taught about slavery is from the point of view of the enslaver, and it's from the point of view of European scholarship and research. That means, even to their best intent, there's probably some things within the research that they're doing that they can't actually interpret, or they can't actually see, because they are not in the African-American culture of community. So being people within the African-American culture and community, we're going back and doing that same research. We're looking at that same information, and we're looking at it from the point of view of the people, or the Africans that were enslaved in that period. That's how you get to a point where we have this obsession with collecting this literature and really going through, what did the enslaved people say about Christianity? And instead of giving you some academic articles, some research journals, or referring you to books from people who wrote for themselves what they believed enslaved people thought about Christianity, one of the missions and visions of the More Than a Fraction Foundation is that to be innovative and to look at the different focal points, we just let it come straight from the people themselves. And so that's kind of the point of this presentation. So setting the framework, European and European American observers, including those with accounts of the enslaved communities, define education exclusively as book learning. So this is an example of historical research not looking at things from the point of view of the enslaved. And thus they refer to the enslaved Africans as uneducated. How many of you have been told that? And an erroneous view that persists. The assumed lack of any education and its consequence of an assumed lack of intelligence leads directly to the still prevalent assumption that any invention and innovation occurring during the time must be credited to the enslaver and to European society in general. Okay. In the Federal Writers Project under the Works Progress Administration, so in the 1930s, the United States realized that the last generation of people who had experienced slavery were in very, very old age. And if they didn't do something to document or interview these people, that perspective was going to be lost forever. But you know, I mean, that's the rationale of the project, and it's a really great project. It's actually available for free at the Library of Congress. You can go online at the link there at the bottom, or you can just Google Born in Slavery, Slave Narratives from the Federal Writers Project, or you can just Google Federal Writers Project and it'll all come up and you can read it for yourself. Some of them are actual recordings and you can hear them for yourself, okay? So they conducted these interviews, they transcribed them, they recorded a lot of them, and it's one of the things they showed is that many of the people that interviewed refer to the African community to be nurturing. And it's a concept that includes learning as evident by the activities that they recounted. So they refer to themselves as learning, but they also referred to the term book learning. So they knew that there was a difference, but they didn't consider themselves as not learning, and they didn't consider themselves as not intelligent. They just realized that they weren't allowed to be book learning. And I'm gonna use the word allowed because I'm going to give you some quotes where they admit that they was playing dumb. Okay, so for example, in the Federal Writers Project, there's a woman, her name is Susan Rose, and she says, people in my day didn't know book learning, but they studied how to protect each other and save them from as much misery as they could. And so this could have included learning about the expectations forced on them, as well as knowing how to act and what to do in the presence of, for the benefit of their European enslavers and communities. So there's an article that was published in 1983 in the Clark Atlanta University magazine called Pipeline, authored by a woman named Janet Cornelius, called "We Slipped and Learned to Read: Slave Accounts of the Literary Process." Okay, so in this article, she provides narrative accounts of formerly enslaved individuals who learned how to read, or book learning, because remember, that's the difference. Based on the information and the data that she collected, Cornelius estimates that about 4% of the formerly enslaved individuals in the interview cohort knew how to read or write, despite the dangers and difficulties thousands of enslaved people learn how to read and write in the antebellum South. So her study focused on the antebellum South. And just remember that slavery was North and South. We don't talk about the North too much because it was the Union, which doesn't give them the viewpoint of being as perfect as they like to call it, but that's another presentation for another day. So in her study of the Federal Writers Project, this is where she's getting her data from. She went through all the interviews, she went through all the transcripts, and she listened to everything that they have, and she came up with this information, this data numbers herself, that when she focused on the antebellum South, because when you look at the Federal Writers Project, it gives you Virginia, Deep South, it gives you those two things. It doesn't give you too much North because mostly slavery is over before then. So a lot of the people that experienced slavery in the North would have passed away by the time they were doing these interviews and these records. So few left traces of their accomplishments, but 272 ex-slaves in the Federal Writers Project who told how they learned to read and write during slavery provided insight into the literary process within the enslaved community. So if it's within the community, can the European community document and write how many or how much of the enslaved community could read and write? Can they? No, they can't. So for example, Sarah Fitzpatrick, a formerly enslaved African woman from Alabama, would state at the plantation where she was held, many slaves could read, but they keep that up their sleeve. Now, sometimes in the Federal Writers Project, I left this exactly the way it is. Sometimes in the Federal Writers Project, they will spell out the dialogue by the accent of the person, right? So they spell out that this woman, Sarah Fitzpatrick, is speaking like deep Southern Alabama accent. They keep that up their sleeve. They played that lot. They couldn't read a bit till after surrender. Okay, but if you just read it clearly, they keep that up their sleeve. They play dumb, like they couldn't read until a bit after surrender. That means until a bit after the Civil War. So I'm not saying that majority of enslaved people on plantations can read, not saying that at all. I'm saying that as a human being today, can you be around something and not pick something up, right? So if a lot of enslaved women or a lot of enslaved men are working in the house, and if a lot of the enslaved women are rearing the white children who are learning how to read and write, do we believe that they're not going to pick something up if they're around it? They're going to pick something up. They're just going to keep it quiet that they picked it up. So if the enslaved community truly lacked book learning, that they would have needed to take the European interpretations of the biblical scriptures at face value, right? If they couldn't read, and would have believed that the same God that they were worshiping and asking for deliverance was the same God that required their subjugation. The efforts to convince the enslaved Africans that God required their servitude was so pervasive that Christian texts, most notably the Bible, was perverted and edited to justify the view that the African was meant to be enslaved by the European and that it was God's will. The most famous example of that is something called the Slave Bible. The Slave Bible is so secretive and hidden that I only know of one copy of it in the United States. I am desperately looking for a copy of it, and everyone else is also. There's one museum that has it that I know of. If another copy ever pops up, it's probably going to go for millions of dollars. So Kira's not going to get it. But the Slave Bible was published in London in 1807 by the Society for the Conversion of Negro Slaves. And the Bible removes references to liberations of slaves, so Moses, to the divine intervention by God for people held in bondage, so the Israelites coming out of Egypt, and to the references of the least of these, so the references of the first will be last and the last will be first, it's taken out. The references of the delivery from Egypt, it's out. The references to the whole Moses story is out. Anything that says that God is for the least of these and God will deliver the enslaved and God was striking down the Pharisees, all of that stuff is removed. So that sets a framework that we're going to get into. So the implication proves true as many of the recorded narratives of the enslaved Africans state that there was a general belief among the enslaved that, for example, a formerly enslaved person recalled that white people taught their niggers what Bible they wanted them to know. They knew it was the wrong one. And that the secretly literate members of the enslaved African community included the enslaved African preacher, who often was permitted to be able to read the Bible and the Bible only, and was how they learned about the liberation and deliverance promises of Christianity, because a lot of times these African preachers were able to get a copy of the actual Bible. Nate Turner is an example of that. So the recollection of Campbell Davis, he was 13 years old when slavery ended, and he says, us get some book learning amongst ourselves around the quarters, which is around the houses, and have our own preacher. They also state that many slaves seldom identified specific reasons why whites taught them to read and write, only that the religious context of much of the teaching by whites stands as the clear motivation. So here's another example. A formerly enslaved person named North Cross, he said, I would shut the doors, put one end of a board into the fire and proceed to study. But whenever I heard the dogs barking, I would throw my book under the bed and peep and listen to see what was up. If no one was near, I would crawl under the bed, get my book, come out, lay flat on my stomach and proceed to study until the dogs would again disturb me. So the former enslaved who learned on their own initiative mentioned that getting to the religious text and the religious context was one of the motivating factors that made them want to read. So we're about to get into bam, 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 one after the other, showing you what other enslaved people say about Christianity. So the point of this presentation is not to convert anyone. The point of the presentation is to answer the question, what did the enslaved think of Christianity? So generally, it's broken down into two categories. A lot of times the enslaved people will refer to what they call the white man's Christianity. This is why on Facebook, when I asked if anyone was interested in this presentation, I said that I believe using the term white man's Christianity has gotten lost in translation over time. During this period of the enslaved people, white man's Christianity was referring to the fact that they knew Christianity was perverted and that it was being used for power and for politics. So Peter Randolph, who was born in 1825, he wrote this statement in 1893. On one occasion, I happened in the courthouse here and was conversing with a white man on the subject of religion, when another informed me that if I had anything to do with politics, I would soon find myself in the jail. He may have said this in the way of a joke, but in those times, many a true thing was said in a joke. So some enslaved actually practiced the white man's Christianity, meaning they accepted, practiced, and tried to spread the perverted version of Christianity because they were looking for power and politics. You see that even now in Christianity, that every Black preacher, every AME church is not pure. You know, some of them are looking for money and power and politics. We see that with some of the Black preachers that are behind or supporting of what we're calling white evangelical, which is pretty much the same version of the white man's Christianity that the formerly enslaved are pointing to, where it's just a perverted sense of Christianity. Oftentimes in the literature, when they're not talking about the white man's Christianity, meaning the perverted Christianity, they call it Christianity, or they call it true Christianity, or they call it pure Christianity, or they call it true religion, or they call it pure religion. But it's important to understand that in 2021, when we're saying white man's Christianity, I believe it has gotten lost in translation. We're saying white man's Christianity now as if to say that white people invented Christianity to subjugate and enslave Africans, that white people made Christianity, or that Christianity is a white man's religion. Because the terminology white man's Christianity has been passed down from generation to generation all the way back to the period of enslavement. But we got lost in translation. White man's Christianity is referring to perverted Christianity. So here's some examples. What did the enslaved think of Christianity? Aaron wrote this in 1845. So when you see a date in parenthetical like that, 1845, that's the date that they wrote it. If I can tell, or if they state what date that they believe they were born. Now, remember, because most of these transcripts that I'm going to give you is really, really deep into the period of slavery before the Civil War. So we're talking about before 1867, most of them are. So at this point, they are speculating their date of birth. So if it's in parentheses, it's the date that this was written or it was published. It is not their date of birth. But you can pretty much get a sense of, if Aaron is writing this in 1845, he's probably born at least 1800, 1800, 1810, unless he's a really young person. So Aaron says, no true-hearted Christian will begin to hold his brother in bonds. The Bible says, he that stealeth a man and selleth him shall surely be put to death. If he is found in his hands, that thief shall die. If a man hateth his brother whom he has already seen, how can he love God whom he has not seen? God says, in the eyes of man, there is respect to persons, but in his eyes, there is no respect to persons. Whenever a man is cleansed from his sin and iniquity, he is a new formed creature in Christ Jesus. Christ is in that white friend in hope of glory, and he is in Christ. And so therefore, there is no respect to persons. He will treat an African brother as well as a white brother. He will not oppress him. If he is a wolf clothed in sheep's clothing, he will stand up and say it is right to enslave the African brother. But if he is a sincere, godly man, he will not stand up and say it is right. John Quincy Adams, born in 1845, wrote this in 1872. So this is a little bit after the Civil War. He says, let every man work for his living as it is said, let everyone live by the sweat of his brow. But not let everyone nor anyone live off the sweat of another's brow without paying for it. Then you will be following the commandments of God. Whoever hear of such a thing as a man working for another for nothing, and he sitting down doing nothing, but only violating the laws of God and just laws of the land, and then say it is right. Many of them now, when they have you to work for them, if you stop 1 minute, they say the Negro is a cheat. But they cannot see that they cheated the Negro. The tearing of the Negro from the soil and shores of his native land and introducing him in the dark, oppressive, and corruptive life of American slavery and holding him there with increased vigor for nearly 250 years presents a gloomy and forlorn picture. He became trained in industry and acquired an elementary knowledge of the English language and the Christian religion, a world language and a world religion. This is a man born in 1845 who writes in 1872 an awareness that Christianity is a world religion and a world language. Charles Ball, he wrote this in 1837, and then it was reprinted in 1859. So he wrote this in 1837. I'm going to call extra attention to the bold, but I'm going to read the whole thing for you. So in this section of his book, he's referring to the teachings of his grandfather who was brought from Africa in 1730. So we often forget that the enslaved people started in Africa. So sometimes they know their African fathers and grandfathers, right? So he does know his African grandfather. And here's what his African grandfather told him. He had singular religious notions, never going to meeting or caring for the preachers he could, if he would, occasionally hear. He retained his native traditions respecting the deity and hereafter. It is not strange that he believed the religion of his oppressors to be the invention of designing men. For the text often is quoted in his hearing was, servants, be obedient to your masters. The idea of a revolution in the conditions of the whites and the blacks is the cornerstone of the religion of the latter. And indeed, it seems to me, at least, to be quite natural, if not in strict accordance with the precepts of the Bible. He never went to church or meeting and held that the religion of this country was altogether false, and indeed, no religion at all, being the mere invention of priests and crafty men who hoped thereby to profit through the ignorance and cruelty of the multitude. Henry Bibb wrote this in 1849. Isn't Henry handsome? Okay, but this is all principally for what of moral instruction. This is where they have no Sabbath schools, no one to read the Bible to them, no one to preach the gospel who is competent to expound the scriptures except slaveholders. And the slaves, with but few exceptions, have no confidence at all in their preaching because they preach a pro-slavery doctrine. No confidence at all in the preachings because they preach a pro-slavery doctrine. I'm gonna say it one more time. No confidence at all in their preachings. They say, servants, be obedient to your masters, and he that knoweth his master's will and doeth it not shall be beaten with many stripes. Means that God will send them to hell if they obey their masters, if they disobey their masters, sorry. This kind of preaching has driven thousands into infidelity. Now, he goes on to explain for about another paragraph about how they would escape to freedom and all that sense. And so I pulled out this additional bold section to show you how he continues to thought that they have no confidence in the preaching. So he says, upon escape, and if they profess religion, this is the enslaved, and have been baptized by a slave-holding minister, they repudiate it after becoming free and are rebaptized by a man who is worthy of doing it according to the gospel rule. They repudiate being baptized by a slave-holding minister and are rebaptized by a man who is worthy of doing it according to the gospel rule. Leonard Black wrote this in 1847. It is a matter of astonishment that slavery has no long existed, and yet that its enormities have taken so little hold of a people professing to be Christians. In a country whose inhabitants dip their hands in blood to establish freedom, there are over 2.5 million of human beings entitled to all the rights of white men, held in absolute bondage. I just want to clarify also that I transcribe it exactly how it appears unless you see the brackets. So capitalization is there, misspelling is theirs. The fact that they don't capitalize white is theirs also, okay? Are the people of this nation aware of this fact? Thousands of times has this awful truth been reiterated in the ears of American Christians, and yet from the profound injustice which yet generally exists on the subject, we are led to ask, do the people of this nation realize that fact? To the enormity of slavery, we are indeed spiritually dead. He's speaking to the nation. John Brown wrote this in 1855. Now, if you see his picture in 1855, he's a pretty good old guy already. So he's probably born late 1700s, early 1800s. I have often been asked how we slaves, being so ignorant, come to know that holding a human creature as a slave is wrong and wicked. But God made every man to stand upright before him. And if the slave law throws that man down, tramples upon him, robs him of his right as a man to the use of his own limbs, of his own faculties, of his own thoughts, shuts him out of the world, up in a world of his own, where all is darkness and cruelty and degradation, and where there is no hope to cheer him on, reducing him, as the law says, to a chattel, then the law unmakes God's work. The slaveholder lends himself to it, and not all the reasonings or arguments that can be strung together on a text or none can make the thing right. I've heard long preachments from ministers of the gospel to try and shew that slavery is not a wrong system, but somehow they cannot fix it right in my mind. And they always seem to me to have a hard matter to bring it square to their own. I have made it in my mind in deathbed scenes. I have witnessed of slaveholders who all their lives had rioted in cruelty to their slaves, but who, when the dark hour came, could not leave the world without asking pardon for all those ill-used. Harriet Jacobs. So Harriet Jacobs wrote this in 1861. The Zoom thing came down to let me know that somebody has a question. I'm waiting for it to disappear so I can see the date. I think it says 1861. If you are going to choose one person in this presentation to go find online a book that has been scanned and a PDF is available, or if you want to hear somebody's story who written their story and you want an audiobook version, Harriet is your girl. Harriet is the one to read. Harriet is a spicy woman. Harriet wasn't taking no junk from the day that she was a little girl. Harriet left no detail out. Harriet left no stone unturned. Harriet gives you the real nitty gritty, okay? So if you can tell that Harriet is one of my favorites. Harriet is the girl. I know we often talk about that we're tired of slave stories and slave movies. Harriet needs to be told, if nobody else, okay? So she says, there is a great difference between Christianity and the religion of the South. I'm gonna repeat that. There is a great difference between Christianity and religion at the South. The conversation of the doctor, and the doctor is her current slaveholder in the point of this book. Okay. So the conversation of the doctor certainly gave me no indication that he had renounced the devil and all his works. In answer to some of his usual talk, I reminded him that he had just joined the church because he was being raunchy to her at the time. Yes, Linda, said he, it was proper for me to do so. I am getting in years and my position in society requires it. I answered that the Bible didn't say so. His voice became hoarse with rage. How dare you preach to me about your infernal Bible, he exclaimed. What right have you, who are my Negro, to talk to me about what you would like and what you wouldn't like? I am your master and you shall obey. No wonder, Harriet says, the slaves sing, oh, Satan's church is here below. Up to God's free church, I hope to go. Harriet's whole book is like that. You got to read Harriet. I believe Harriet is actually available online and scanned. So if you Google incidents in the life of a slave girl written by herself and look up Harriet Jacobs, it should come up for you. Lewis Clark wrote this in 1845. When the master or his representative, the man who justifies slaveholding, comes with the whip in one hand and the Bible in the other, the slave says, at least in his heart, because he may not say it out loud, lay down one or the other. Either make the tree good and the fruit good, or else both corrupt together. Slaves do not believe that the religion which is from God bears whips and chains. They ask empathetically concern their Father in heaven. Has he bid you buy and sell us, speaking from his throne in the sky? Francis Frederick wrote this in, hold on, y'all, I don't think it's gonna let me go by until I look at this stuff. Okay. So Francis says, when first I came to England, I was surprised to find every clergyman and dissenting minister to a man denouncing slavery as contrary to Christianity. So he is from Virginia, Kentucky, but at this point in his story, he's in England. So he says, but the reverse is the case in the southern states of America. All the Methodists, Baptists, and Independents, in fact, every minister of religion, upholds slavery and defend it by passages from the very same book out of which the clergy in this country make quotations to condemn it. I leave the natural inference to be drawn by themselves. He's basically saying, I ain't gonna say nothing, but you come to your own conclusion. I'm merely suggesting that perhaps self-interest may, in other cases also, cause fatal delusions and compliances. Isaac Williams wrote this in 1885. Now, Isaac is an example of a formerly enslaved teaching the true Bible and what happens when the enslavers find out that they're teaching the true Bible and not the slave version of it, okay? So he says, one of my best friends and counselors, the Reverend Moses Myers, was sold from the plantation he was on to some Georgia man only because his masters thought he preached too much and, as he said, had got religion on the brain. He was a man about 65 years of age at the time I speak of, and if he did have religion on his brain, he certainly had it in his heart also. For a more lovable, cheery old gentleman I never met. Lucius Henry Housley wrote this in 1898. He's a handsome man also. As this one government has been perverted by men, so this one religion has been corrupted and perverted by the same power. But its great pillars of truth remain. Idolatry itself is only a fearful perversion of original religion or ancient Christianity. But as a false coin proves the existence of a true coin, so false religion proves that there is a true religion. So Lucius's position is the fact that the white man or the enslaver had to create a perverted version of Christianity only means that they are acknowledging that there is a true Christianity that doesn't agree with their actions and their messaging. Jermaine Wesley Logan, he wrote this in 1859. He's also a very good one too, but he's very long-winded. So if you want to read a second one, so first I would recommend Harriet. If you want to read another one, you can read Jermaine Wesley Logan. Now, Harriet is an enslaved woman, so majority of her book isn't about Christianity. Majority of her book is her getting spicy, and every 30 pages, she thinks she's about to get lynched or whipped to death. And you really do expect it because she's off the chain. If you really want someone to tell you about slavery directly from the point of view of Christianity, then you want to read Jermaine Wesley Logan. And I'm recommending him also because I believe his book is also scanned on the internet. So he wrote this in 1859. He says, oh, that everybody would teach and live such religion as that. We need not be here plotting to get away from these devil deacons into Illinois if they did. If I ever get to a free country, I mean to learn and preach that religion as the means of putting down the religion of the slaveholders, sorry. I'm gonna repeat that, as the means of putting down the religion of the slaveholders. What a wicked thing it is that our mothers, brothers, and sisters cannot be delivered until this religion is put down. They make a great fuss about religion as if it requires much learning and study to get at it. The truth about it is, it requires skill and study to give it a false face and cover it up. I'm gonna read that again. The truth about it is, it requires skill and study to give it a false face and cover it up. He means that it requires a lot of skill to create a false version of Christianity or to take the Bible and make it into lies or go against what it actually says. The children understand it better than the minister. It is to live right. It is to do justly, to do good to others, from a love of doing good, not because you are afraid of God or afraid of hell, but because it is your delight in life to do it. This book was written in 1839. The person who wrote it did not want to give any hint towards their identity. So it is written by runaway. And one of the reasons that he would want to do something like this is because if you read Harriet's book gives you a taste of this, is that when they run away, they change their names, but often they would still get caught. And if they're recognized by someone from the South who's visiting up north, and then they can still get in trouble. And so there are often enslaved who just completely go off the grid and they just try to disappear completely. And so with this person, you get an idea is that he wants to tell his story. He wants to get the information out there. And that in itself for him is probably a very courageous thing to do, because he still doesn't put his name, but he's willing to write it down anyway and get it published, which means there's a handful of people who know he's the one who did it, and he did it anyway. So he says, I have lived with a good many masters, but never found any who cared to let their slaves go to meeting, he means church, or who talked with us about religion. But two free colored men came out by night and preached. One of them could read, and the other only prayed. The patrol, which is the early stages of the police force of today, found it out and went among them and caught the preachers and tied them up and gave them a bad whipping. They gave one of them more than 100 lashes. He was whipped so bad that he could not get away for 2 days. They told them they were going about putting the devil into the rest of the niggers, and that if they ever come back, they will put a load of shot into them, which means it was highly disregarded. It was highly illegal. It was highly frowned upon to teach true or pure Christianity. They knew that they were doing a perverted version of Christianity, right? So when we use rhetoric like the white man's Christianity, we're actually continuing on the work of the slaveholders of trying to convince people that Christianity belongs to white people and white culture, and that their translation or perversion of it is true Christianity. Reverend David Smith, born in 1784, wrote this in 1881. Now, Reverend David Smith is an example of a formerly enslaved person practicing the white man's Christianity. But I want you to pay attention about how it's frustrating in his book is that the rest of the enslaved community, or the African-American community, completely reject him, because they know that he's teaching a white man's Christianity, because they've already established within the community this concept of the white man's Christianity. So here's what he says. But alas, a cloud of opposition arose because he showed up on a plantation. He was supposed to preach to the enslaved community out of the Bible, and they started booing and yelling and throwing things at him because of what he was preaching. So that's the cloud of opposition that arose. I perceived that I was not going to have it pleasant all the while. Soon my own people became jealous of me and my work, thinking and saying that I was too young to be allowed to carry on those meetings. But the white people thought differently, for many of their servants were professing the Christian religion at those meetings and consequently made better servants. Hence, they spoke well of me, he means the white people, and did all they could to protect and enhance my efforts. Leela Amos Pendleton, born in 1860, wrote this in 1912. So she's an example, and I think a couple right before her, when they talk about ancient Christianity, means that the knowledge of Christianity starting in Africa is actually came over with them from West Africa and is being passed down from generation to generation, where they know that Christianity is an ancient religion that started in Africa, the modern Middle Eastern regions. So they already know that, they know it, okay? So she writes, it was when Alexandria was the fountain of the learning of the ancient world that the Christian religion took root in Northern Africa. There were men from Africa present in Jerusalem on the day of the Pentecost, when hundreds testified to the wonderful works of God, each in his own tongue. These men and others first took the gospel to Africa, and it flourished there unhindered for nearly 3 centuries. Peter Randolph wrote this in 1893. The next overseer was Hardin Harrison. He owned 3 slaves himself, but was very religious and belonged to the Presbyterian Church. He did not beat so much as Adams, but was very strict with the slaves. He used to say his prayers every night and grace before his meals. Sometimes his grace failed him, and then the poor slave must expect something more than soft words or gentle treatment. He never yet had grace sufficient to excuse any little fault in a Negro. He used to quote Moses' law to whip by. His face was very narrow and hypocritical. And what's in bold is very important. He just enough of professed religion to deceive. He was one of those calculated to deceive northern visitors who saw him go on with his solemn ceremonies of religion to make them believe that good and religious men guided the poor, ignorant Blacks and kept them from sinking entirely into the blackness of heathenism. Oloda, I can never pronounce this right, and I apologize. Oloda Equiano. I can always do his last name. The first name always gets me. He wrote this in 1789. Now he was born. He wrote this in 1789. So Equiano was taken from West Africa. He was enslaved actually in England, and then he gained his freedom and was going around educating about slavery. Equiano is a really good one to read also, because he has a really good explanation about how when you're looking at the history of slavery, you have to be very, very careful about looking at it simply from the European or the white enslaver point of view. In his book, he explained that when we use the word slave, that we all think we're meaning the same thing. In his book, he says, and this is not the quote, I just want to get into Equiano a little bit for a quite quick second. Equiano explains in his book, if you go find it, I actually think he's one of the most referenced books written by enslaved persons. So you could probably find that his in your local library. You could probably buy a print of it off Amazon for like $4 or something. But he explains that a slave in West Africa was not the same as slave in chattel slavery. He explains that the concept was very different, that a slave in West Africa, when we use the word slave and we say, well, they were slaves in Africa, we think we still mean the European version of slavery. He explains that it's not, that slave in West Africa was more equivalent to servant in European language than it is to slave in European language. So when people say that there were slaves in Africa, or if you go to African historical context and they use the term slave, it is not the same meaning. So you have to be very careful about linguistics when looking at historical documentation. But on the subject of Christianity, Equiano says, that part of Africa known by the name of Guinea, to which the trade for slaves is carried on, extended along the coast above 3,400 miles from the Senegal to Angola, and includes a variety of kingdoms. Of these, the most considerable is the kingdom of Benin. He spells Benin that way, not me. This kingdom is divided into many provinces or districts, and one of the most remote and fertile of which is called Igbo. I was born in the year 1745 in a charming, fruitful vale named Isaka. He taught me, now he's talking about his slave master at the time, to shave and dress hair a little, and also to read in the Bible, explaining many passages to me, which I did not comprehend. I was wonderfully surprised to see the laws and rules of my country written almost exactly here. I'm going to repeat that because he's talking about what he's reading in the Bible. I was wonderfully surprised to see the laws and rules of my country written almost exactly here in the Bible. A circumstance which I believe tended to impress our manners and customs more deeply on my memory, which means he saw so much of Igbo in the Bible that it helped him maintain his memory of home. I used to tell him of this resemblance, and many a times we have sat up the whole night together at this employment. James Watkins wrote in 1860, as to slavery in its own nature, nothing can be said but that it is the grossest evil under the sun. It is, in truth, every possible wrong in one. Rob a man of his clothes, his watch, his purse, his house, his lands. Is not this a moral evil, a sin? If not, what of the laws of civilized communities, jails and gallows? But is it not a greater evil to rob a man of himself than to strip him of his coat, to pull down his house and to drive him from his home. The degrees of evil in each case can bear no comparison. Slavery is robbery in its highest possible enormity. To say that villainy like this can in any way be identified with Christianity is to degrade our holy religion to a co-partnership or connivance with man's greatest, most concentrated and unmitigated crimes against his fellows. There is not a truth, a doctrine, a principle, a perception of the gospel which, if fairly carried out, would not annihilate slavery. The very existence of the church is fundamentally opposed to the spirit and injustice of this evil. How can a slaveholder make his servants his property and then meet them as brethren at the table of the Lord? And yet this is the system, and this is the crime which has the patronage and support of the ministers of religion in the slave-holding states. I'm just a messenger, y'all. So final points, the contradiction on the view of Christianity by people who were enslaved compared to what they were taught by the European enslavers implies that some sort of study, practice, or conversation was occurring that justified their collective belief that Christianity would deliver them from the bondage of slavery. The implication proves true as many of the recorded narratives of the enslaved Africans state that there was a general belief among the enslaved that, for example, white people taught their niggas what Bible they wanted them to know, and that knew about the liberation and deliverance promised of true Christianity. So there's some additional resources for you. Clark Atlanta University, it's so actually that article there, We Slipped and Learned, it's behind a paywall because it is a research journal, but I believe it's available on one where you can get 3 free articles a month. So if you do a search for it, it should come up for you. And then the University of North Carolina actually has scanned a lot of these books from formerly enslaved people if you want to go through it. When you go through that website, you're going to be totally overwhelmed. So like you're going to leave here today, you're like, I'm going to go read, right? And then you're going to go to University of North Carolina, it's just going to be a long list, okay? If you go to this website, I want you to understand that there are 2 types of slave narratives that are out there from this historical period when we're talking about 1830 to like 1880, okay? There are ones that are actually written by enslaved people themselves. It will say as such. It will say, you know, so-and-so's story from slavery to freedom written by himself. Or it will say written by Harriet Jacobs, for example, and then, you know, the stories about Harriet Jacobs. So if the story is about Harriet Jacobs and it's written by Harriet Jacobs, it's written by herself. There are other times where you would sleeve a narrative where it would say Joe Smith, 20 years in slavery, 20 years free, written by Isabella Jones and Thomas Jefferson Smith and blah, blah, blah. And that's a lot of times are, they're either abolitionists who are trying to help enslaved people tell their stories. So a lot of times these are the ones who cannot write and read. And so in those books, they say that they are transcribing or they're telling you the story that the enslaved person told them, okay? And then there are other times where it is publication companies who are saying the same thing. I take those a little bit more lightly for obvious reasons than the ones who are actually written by enslaved people themselves, because I don't completely trust that translators are not taking liberty, because a lot of times, you know, if you're interested and you read one of those books, they will insert their thoughts into the enslaved person telling their story. And that annoyed me a little bit. So I'm not a really fan of those versions, but there is a story to be told there and it is valuable. I do read them, but I kind of read them the whole time with kind of this face, like, can you stop inserting your own thoughts into the story? Okay, so that's it. I could pull more from you, but you can imagine that you have to go through the books and I have to remember where I had seen these passages in order to pull them out for you and to go over it. And I didn't really have a lot of time to do it because, you know, I had the thing last weekend for the Day of Honor for Thomas Fraction down at Virginia Tech. So I hope you enjoyed it. I will take questions now in the Q&A section. I see in the chat that Valerie provided that I think it was probably during Harriet Jacobs, that there's an audio book in the library as well as Harriet Jacobs. So yeah, Harriet Jacobs, someone went ahead and recorded her story in an audio book. So if you're like me, you do a lot of driving and you listen to an audio book while you're in the car, Harriet Jacobs is a good one to refer to. She can get graphic at times, so be prepared to listen to Harriet Jacobs. She does not hold anything back, but you definitely will learn from Harriet Jacobs. So for example, a lot of people don't know that for New Year's Eve was actually not a great holiday for the enslaved community back during slavery. New Year's Eve, that a lot of the enslaved who were often rented out by their slave masters would have to gather in this field. And there were other slave masters would gather in the field, and they would just really walk around the field and to start pointing to people who they wanted to acquire for the year and rent from their slave masters. And that was another way that people were kind of wrenched away from each other. And the way Harriet described it is, she said, you can see clearly in the field the most brutal slaveholders or people that they would work for, because all of the enslaved community would kind of move to the other side of the field because no one wants to be chosen by that person. And to be chosen by that person was, you know, it was devastating for them to know that they would have to spend a year with that person. And so that's one thing I actually didn't know until I heard it from Harriet, that New Year's Eve and New Year's Day was not always the time that African Americans or Black people celebrated, because it meant something different to us for a long period of time. So I'm going to go to the Q&A. First question is, what is the process for transcribing these writings? And so what I was doing was actually typing them. I believe for like the University of North Carolina, they did a project for a couple of years where they had acquired a lot of these books. And remember, I said that these books are very, very expensive. So they had acquired a lot of these books and they got grant funding, and they held a project where they just hired people and they had volunteers that was just typing the books up and transcribing them. And so if you go to the University of North Carolina's website, that's where a lot of them is. When you look at the transcription, because even when you find these books, they're not always in the best condition. Some of the words might be worn off, some of the words might be torn. So in the transcribed versions, if they can't tell what a word is, they'll say that they can't read it, or they'll say that it's unclear in the transcription. And so that's always helpful. Are there any other questions? You can enter it into the Q&A. If not, we got through it in an hour. That's great. I was trying to keep it deep but quick for you, because I know it's Friday evening, in case you had plans or in case you just want to get some rest before your weekend gets started. Thank you everyone for participating and for dialing in. I really appreciate it. I am recording this, and so I will post it to morethanafraction.org if you want to view it later on. If you want to refer anyone to it, I'll probably do it over the weekend, if not by Monday close of business for sure. Thank you so much. I will linger for about 5 more minutes in case anyone has any questions and answers. Otherwise, enjoy your evening. So Robin, you asked, I assume that the Quakers and abolitionists from the North would have known true Christianity versus the perverted version. That's actually not a safe assumption to make, and here's why. Being in the North, or being an abolitionist, or being a Quaker meant that you were against slavery. It did not mean that you were for equality. It did not mean that you believe that Black people in general were the same to you. It did not mean that you thought that Black people deserved the same in the nation or in the community as you did either. So it's very possible that they had believed in the perverted version of Christianity while also being against slavery. You know what I mean? So it's not a safe assumption to make, but it's possible. I'm not going to put the Quakers into that. The Quakers, it's like a version of abolitionists on steroids. I think Quakers were a little bit more aligned with Christianity, probably more than abolitionists were, because in some of the books that were published that was telling the story of the enslaved, and remember I said when the abolitionist was writing it on behalf of the enslaved people, some of their language actually refers to the possibility that they did believe in the perverted version of Christianity. They called Black people wretched. You know, they talked about them as if they were still saving the heathens, and it is them who are going to deliver the Blacks or deliver the Africans from, you know, their condition or from themselves, or teach them Christianity so that they can align to God and go to heaven. And so there's probably still some issue there about the two versions of Christianity that is being practiced in the United States at the time. And then of course, like we know, it's still today. Right now, we split it into what? Christianity, Baptist Christianity, and no. Right now, we divide it into white evangelicalism and other Christianity. It just changed his name. So the next question, Nate Turner obtained the original Bible and not the slave Bible. Yes, and Nate Turner, and if you can, I think if you Google slave Bible, there's a picture of it at the museum, and you can, and then Nate Turner's Bible is actually at the new museum in DC for African American history. And I believe there's a picture online of Nate Turner's Bible. If you get Nate Turner's Bible and then look at the picture of the Bible that's at the museum, the slave Bible, you can see the size difference. It's a completely different Bible. And from some of the examples we've gone over, to have the real Bible oftentimes was frowned upon and you would be punished for it. So who wrote the slave Bible and when? Let's go back. Let's go back. So there you go. So the slave Bible was written in 1807 in London by the Society for the Conversion of Negro Slaves. Conversion of Negro slaves. Conversion of Negro slaves. To what? To this perverted version of Christianity. So if you ever come out and about and you find an original version of the slave Bible from 1807, it's better than winning the lottery. Any other questions? Okay, again, thank you guys for tuning in. I really appreciate it, and have a good evening and a good weekend. Until next time.